So during this afternoon session, the panel will present on how regulatory compliance in medtech is a tool for success. I will shortly hand to Jay Sharp, Communications Officer at Medtech, who's going to be our moderator for this afternoon. Just in advance of that, we all know the protocol, so please remain on mute whilst the speakers are presenting, but also because it is a workshop and we do appreciate having some interaction as well. Please feel free to use the chat box, and also if you would like to unmute and speak as well, then that's also very welcome. And you can also indicate that in the chat box if you'd like to unmute, just say that, no problem at all. So as you know, we are recording, you just heard the prompt there, and this will be available as part of the on-demand content for the On Helix conference. So with that, I'm going to disappear and I'm going to hand the stage over to Jay. Over to you.
Thank you, Alicia, for passing it on, and a very big welcome to one and all present here. First of all, I would like, on behalf of On Helix, Medtech, and all the panelists here, I would like to welcome all the audiences and the members who are attending the conferences. Apart from that, I would now like to welcome all our panelists for the day. So at first, we have Greer Deal from Medtech, and I request all the panelists to kindly wave to the audience when I take your names. Yes, so yes, we have Greer Deal from Medtech. Then we have next Dr. Oliver Bonner from the University of Cambridge. And next we have Liz from Afford Theory Development. Along with that, we have Brenda Dooley from Access Consulting. And last but not the least, we have Greg from Thai Medical. So yes, a very warm welcome to all the panelists, and let's get into the session today. So as you all know that Alicia mentioned about, we are going to talk on regulatory and how a medical device focuses on different regulatory aspects. So we have Dr. Oliver, who has been a creator and he is a manufacturer of a medical device or a medtech, medical technology. So Oliver, can you please enlighten us about what medical device or technology you have created and what are the challenges that you faced while creating it?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge, and along with my colleagues in the Department of Pediatrics and our local hospital, Addenbrooke's Hospital, we have been developing a device that creates a bridge between the vital sign sensors and the patient monitor in neonatal intensive care. So just a little bit of background on that. So around 100,000 babies receive neonatal care every year in the UK. And the vast majority of these babies have their vital signs monitored. So that's ECG, oxygen saturation, temperature. And these sensors are connected by wires to the patient monitor. The wires create a barrier to parents bonding and physical contact with their babies, and also to other clinical care. And that leads to sort of barriers to physical touch, etc. So a wireless system will, I should say, remove that barrier, and the intention is to increase the amount of physical contact that parents can have with their baby, which can lead to increased breastfeeding, improved short and long-term clinical outcomes. So we've been developing this system over the last several years in an academic setting. And we've now tested the proof of concept with babies at Addenbrooke's Hospital. And we're now looking to sort of make the transition towards a commercial system in order to actually realize that the impact that the system can have. Clearly, moving from an academic device, proof of concept device, through to a commercial device is a rather significant change in terms of the risk profile and actually how the level of scrutiny which is going to be required in order to get the device onto the market. So as you might imagine, there are a large number of regulatory challenges associated with the creation of such a device. The sort of broad challenges that we're facing, which most, or if not all, medical devices are facing at the moment, with the introduction of the UK CA marking in the UK. In Europe, obviously, they've just completed the switch over to the MDR. And both of these things are putting pressures on notified bodies. Now, notified bodies are the people that actually sort of scrutinize applications for regulatory approval. And if they are pressured, time pressured, and it increases the pathway to actually getting your device on the market. So being alive to this, putting plans in early, really important for us to make sure that we're mitigating this risk early on. Obviously, regulatory so the regulatory pathway is a complex pathway, and it's all the more tricky at the moment. Just a couple of other things sort of relating to the what we're doing. So obviously we're a relatively complex Class 2B medical device. And there are lots of specific challenges associated with that. So, for instance, sterilization, medical software, wireless communications. And we've got a team in place that's got a lot of experience in this, but having support in order to actually expert support to sort of get those things right early on, right from the start, is desperately important. And making sure that we're planning for the future, setting up a quality management system for the company that will eventually be the legal manufacturer for the device, making sure we're ready for the auditing that's going to come when we make the submission to the notified bodies, all really important, and making sure we understand what the challenges are in the long term as well. So
So that's quite interesting. And yes, even recently, I have joined the Medtech space as a communications officer, but I have been interacting with so many people around. And yes, I understand the challenges that you are facing. And even in the audience, we might be having some manufacturers or regulatory people facing similar challenges. So as you mentioned about different regulatory elements involved in UK, maybe the UK CE mark or the MDR in Europe, I'm sure I have someone who will be able to enlighten you further on this. So I would now like to pass it on to Greer Deal from Medtech. And this is a note for all the presenters that whenever I pass on the mic to you, please describe your company so that the audience know what exactly your company does. Highlight yourselves, highlight your companies, and then you can answer and give your insights on the topic you are going to speak on. So Greer, over to you now.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for the introduction. So yes, I'm director of Medtech, based in the lovely location of Galway in Ireland, and we focus on regulatory affairs and quality compliance. We were actually spun out of the parent company Global Regulatory Services. Many One Nucleus members and attendees will recognise the name Global Regulatory Services, as we've worked closely with One Nucleus over the years. But today is all about medtech, and that's what Medtech is all about. Very much focusing on supporting the medtech industry. With Oliver, it was actually GRS consultants who supported Oliver in developing a regulatory strategy and pathway to the market. And I was really interested when Oliver first reached out to us that he identified regulatory as a critical risk point and wanted to address it. And from my perspective, that was really refreshing, because usually what happens is that you get these entrepreneurs developing this wonderful technology and they hurtle down it through the development process. And then someone says, well, what about the regulatory? And they go, what's that? And then they come to someone like us, to someone like Medtech, and invariably we have to unpick quite a few things. And sometimes they've made they've committed to a particular pathway that you can't unpick that, and they have to go down that pathway. So just backtracking a little bit, as Oliver will know, it's very, very important to actually define your product. Now, people think, I know what my product is. Yes, but do you know what it is with respect to the regulations? And so as a company, what we often do is we will actually help a company define their product. And we do that by doing a regulatory affairs and quality compliance strategy report. And the very first thing that we do is we look at the intended purpose. So what is this device is diagnostic for? And when we say that, we're not looking for pages and pages of information. We're looking for 2-3 paragraphs. And in that, it will say what the device, the diagnostic is for, the population it's intended for, obviously the medical condition to be treated, to be addressed. So those are some of the key factors. And then what we look at is the actual regulations themselves and what the definition of a device or a diagnostic is. And we look at the rules in those regulations which apply to that device. And it's a very logical process. Interestingly, it is important to get someone who's objective to make this assessment, because we have had some clients who've actually adapted the rules so that it suits them, but actually isn't the reality. So it is important to get your definition right. And once you've defined your product, then that actually helps all the other jigsaw pieces come together. And today we've got people on the panel who are part of that jigsaw puzzle. And it's important to be able to bring those all together to create that picture of the final technology, which is then presented to and used by patients. We don't work in silos. So as part of this report, which I've got to say investors love because they don't like risk too much, they want to know that where they're going to invest their money is going to be fairly safe. So they like to see our regulatory strategy reports because it shows that companies have identified this as a potential risk, which is what Oliver did. But you know, they now understand what the pathway is to market, what's involved, the timelines and the costs, very importantly. So as part of our approach, we've defined the product, we've determined a risk classification, and then we're looking at, well, what clinical data have they got? You know, are they going to need clinical investigations? And Liz will talk about that a little later. But also talking about risk, you know, how do people use this device, this diagnostic? Is it to use? Is it someone who suffers from arthritis? You know, can they hold it? And this is the kind of thing that Greg will be touching on with human factors. So these are all things that we look at as regulatory affairs professionals. And then we can bring in this additional expertise for the entrepreneurs so that they address every single aspect. Of course, the other thing is you could have the most wonderful product, but you know, can you sell it? Are you actually going to be able to access the market that you want to enter? So we have Brenda Dooley of Access Consulting who will explain more about that, but about that later. You know, it's you could be like Apple and create this wonderful market. Everyone wants an iPhone. You know, can't do without a phone now. But did we ever know that we needed one? Was it always a critical part of our lives? No, it wasn't. So if you're really, really clever, you could create your market, but invariably, no, we can't. We are satisfying unmet medical needs usually, but also we're looking at how can we enter a particular territory. So, you know, are we looking at the UK? Are we looking at the Nordics? Or are we thinking further afield to places like Japan and China? So how do we access those markets? So, you know, like I said, we don't work in silos. But regulatory actually feeds into all of this and helps join it all together. It's kind of like a wheel, you know, we're like the hub, and people can disagree with me, but that's how I feel, like we're the hub, and then sort of, you know, the spokes go out to other areas, and then all that information comes together back in for the client, for the entrepreneur. So regulatory, you know, as long as you define your product correctly at the beginning, with your commercial hat on as well, because sometimes you have options. So, you know, if you're looking, like a lot of apps and software, they're often could just sit in the wellness space. Now, a lot of companies don't have much funding at the beginning, so they're thinking, okay, we want to be in the wellness first off, but actually we do want to move into medical in the future. So what we do is we help them lay down the foundation stones so that when they do transition to being a medical device, it's a very smooth transition. But of course, the costs actually escalate. So this is where the commercial point comes in, as well as the regulatory, because obviously the lower risk classification, if you're in a wellness space, the regulatory burden, as people call it, isn't so great and the costs aren't so great. So we'd be looking at that as well. And if you've got that choice, then that's fine. We do find some clients, though, actually say, okay, we know that most people think we're a wellness product, but actually, as a selling point, as a marketing point, we want to be medical. So make us medical. Sometimes that's impossible, but you know, sometimes it's okay. So where there's choice, then we can identify those choices and be able to say, you know, what the implications are to the company. But once that decision has been made, then, like I said, all those jigsaw pieces come together, and you then get that whole picture, and nothing is missing. And that's what's really important. But if you get your classification wrong at the beginning, you're going to get into all sorts of trouble with the authorities later down the line. And that's really difficult to unpick. So it's important to spend time working on your intended use statement and defining your product. It really is worth doing that. So you've got this wonderful concept. You know, you're looking to further develop it. You're going to have to scale it up. That's the other thing. Can you scale it up? In which case you need your quality management system. But importantly as well, have you got the clinical evidence to support what you're saying about your device or your claims? And I'm actually going to hand over to Liz, if that's all right now, to talk about clinical investigations and the strategy and how important that is and how that fits into the picture of developing your device for commercialization.
Thanks, Greer. I'm Liz. I co-founded A40 Development 5 years ago in Ireland with Nicola Wall, and then consequently in the UK to a year later. We provide clinical research services, the full range of services to clients in the UK, in Ireland, in the rest of mainland Europe, and in North America currently. So that's us. I personally have 25 years experience in clinical research. So if I haven't come across it or experienced it, I probably know someone who has at this point. So yeah, I think, Greer, you kind of alluded to some of the things that I was going to say, which I hope only serves to highlight how important it is that this isn't seen as a you know, a subsequential process. It's us all working together to understand clients' needs and, you know, what is it we're all trying to achieve, and to get from A to B in the most cost-effective way with the data that you need. So I think you know, my remit was to throw some light on clinical investigations. So I think there's a lot in that sentence, an awful lot. And I think, you know, there's an increased focus in this space at the moment. You know, certainly in the device and medtech space. I think in pharma there's always been a fairly clear path to market, and a general acceptance that that's going to cost. I think that, you know, with recent changes in regulations in the medical device space, things have become, the bar's been raised, I suppose, essentially, and things have become more, or needed to be more robust. And, you know, there's good reason for that in a lot of cases. You know, if you have an invasive device, if you have a class 3 implantable device, then, you know, why should it not have to stand up to the same amount of rigor as a pharmaceutical just because you're not swallowing a pill? So, you know, we've all heard the news stories of why we needed to change the regulations. And I think the first thing that I think it's important to say is that gathering clinical evidence does have a cost associated with it. And that's important to understand. I think in the past, it perhaps didn't. And I think that, you know, there's some filtering through the rocks to come now, so that SMEs and startups and young companies understand that that will be the case, and they know that, you know, you have to go out there and find the funding to be able to do what it is you're going to need to do. So I think there is that lag still. I'm hopeful that the gap will close, and everybody will start to be on the same page. I think there's been a lot of kicking and screaming to be brought to this point. And I think, you know, it's important to understand that gathering clinical evidence isn't only a regulatory requirement. And again, to highlight where, Brenda fits into the picture. We've direct experience with a client who had a CE mark device, but said we can't sell it to anyone because we don't have any clinical evidence. So it's really important to get over immediately that view that it's a regulatory thing, because it isn't. You might be required in order to gain approvals to gather a certain amount of clinical evidence, but it's really understanding what data your market will need and what data your sales force will therefore need to be armed with to go out there and sell that product when it hits the market, and to get into those markets that you want to get into. I suppose most importantly, any clinical trial needs to be well designed, and that means a whole host of things. We run a whole separate webinar on what that means in practice, but it has to have clinically relevant endpoints. It has to be scientifically robust enough to answer the question, is A better than B, or is it non-inferior, or what is it we're trying to prove, or what are we trying to answer here? And it's very important that that's taken seriously, and the right trial is designed from the outset, because when you go to submit for your clinical trial approvals, you will be fully expected to be able to demonstrate how you calculated your sample size, or you will also be expected to explain how, if you haven't got a statistically powered study, because it's a first in man study or a very small study, you will still be expected to justify why you've chosen that number of participants for your study. So you really do need to think hard about the right trial. And then once you have the right trial, you need to make sure that you're conducting it in an appropriate group of people, in an appropriate location, and by appropriate people. And again, there's a lot there. So, it's no good designing a trial to be delivered in the Netherlands if that's not how the healthcare system works in the Netherlands. It can be very easy to make an expensive mistake at this point. You need to be designing the study for the healthcare environment that you're planning to approach. So you need to have a good understanding of where those participants will be and how they're being routinely seen now in healthcare, because the more you mirror standard practice in your trial, the more accessible your trial is and appealing to people to take part in, if it's only a few extra things that have to get done. So I think that's very important to remember. Who is going to be delivering your study? That's really important too. A lot of people go straight for the huge professor at the world leading institution, and that's not necessarily the right thing to do. It could be, it depends on the trial. But you need to bear in mind that person's likely to be very, very, I won't say overcommitted, but committed to a lot of other things: conferences, travel, other studies, other products, and their institution may be well aware of the role that they play in research and charge accordingly, or have particularly protracted contracting timelines that make it really difficult to get in and get studies up and running there. So there's very much more to it than being in touch with a key opinion leader who says, I'll run your study. The key opinion leader is only going to be responsible for delivering a small part of that study, and there's a whole other piece that sits behind that in terms of the trial applications and all the documents that have to be created. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. And if you are considering conducting a trial in a non-English speaking country, then you must also bear in mind that you are required to have oversight of that. So, without resources on the ground and local knowledge of processes and the research infrastructure and local language, that could prove to be quite difficult. So, that's certainly something else to bear in mind. It's really important to understand that clinical trials are only successful if people want to take part in them. If you don't have anybody taking part in your trial, you don't have a trial. And long been recognised in industry that the number one reasons that trials fail is recruitment and retention. So, there's a few things that are important to point out around that. The industry as a whole has a whole host of solutions, in inverted commas, to this, from, simple things like texting and calling to remind people of appointments and assessment visits, right through to this whole concept of let's make it all decentralized. It will be much simpler for everyone. And, that's not necessarily the case either. So it's a spectrum, and a lot of these big solutions come at quite a significant cost. So they're not even in the realms of possibility for very, very small companies who only want to run small studies. I think these are better solutions for the huge multinational 30 country, 1,000 patient study. But yeah, there's a lot to bear in mind when you're designing that trial and thinking about where you might want to place it, and who's going to participate in it. So thinking about inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and again mirroring what's normally happening with these people when they're being cared for by their health practitioners. So if we want to know whether people would be likely to take part in a study, why don't we ask them? Why don't we involve them in designing the study? Why don't we talk to them about, what the documents will say and look like that they'll be asked to read, what the adverts will say that ask them if they're interested in participating. People should be involved in all of that, right through from the research question that's important to answer. As Oliver said, clearly identified that that's a huge thing. People can't really touch their baby, their premature babies very easily, and that's a huge, I imagine, that's a huge thing that people want to be removed from their lives if they have that situation. So it would be fantastic, I imagine, for all parents and premature babies if they could have that skin contact. So finding out what's important to people and what the big questions are and the big issues, and then prioritizing research around solving those is paramount. It really is very important. So I think there's a lot of human factors stuff as well, as I'm sure Greg will come on to talk about, that can be addressed early on in the research process and the research design process. So it's a waste of everyone's time, effort and cost to get to the point of a clinical trial to find out everyone hates the device. They wish it did this, or it's pointless if it doesn't do that. So I think, before you even start to think about clinical trials, there's a lot of work that can be done with focus groups. And I'm sure Greg will embellish us further with that.
Yes. Before I move on with Greg, I have one question for you, Liz. At times when I was interacting, or if I'm surfing on, I have seen these companies who are quite young, and they come up and they ask a simple question like, I want to run a clinical evaluation for 100 participants, and I am restricted to my budget. The budget is somewhat around £100,000. So what is your reaction if someone comes up to you in this particular manner, saying that, yeah, I want to go for 100 evaluations, but my budget is only £100,000?
Yeah, and that is very common. I think that one of the most common questions we get asked is, how much will my trial cost?
Mm-hmm.
I need to complete an application for funding. How much is this going to cost? And I think our answer to that is always, well, why don't we take a step back and do a small piece of work that's affordable to look at what your trial will probably look like, bearing in mind, it doesn't have to initially be everything. We take into account client circumstances and client budgets. So, it might be that a client only wants to get to proof of concept, and then they don't even want to continue to own the product. They're looking to out-license it or become acquired, or, however that fits into their own commercialization and exit strategies. So, we would always say, let's sit down and look at the question you're trying to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Design an affordable small trial around that, and then you will have a good idea then as to what you might be looking at in terms of cost.
Oh, yes, it's going to be interesting when I feel someone comes up and talks to you about clinical evaluations. Well, I guess now I am inspired that I should go and make a medical device and take advice from all of you because we have such a great panel present here. And yes, while we were marketing this entire seminar series and the conference, so there was one question that had popped up from some visitors or followers of our social media pages. And that question, I guess Greg would be the right person to answer that, while he also describes about the human factor testing. So Greg, I had a question from the audience asking about what exactly is human factor testing, because many new entrepreneurs, new developers, or medical device manufacturers, they have very little idea about what different elements are involved in the entire process of production. So can you please throw some light on human factor testing? And also don't forget, you have to mention about your company, describe what your company does, and then we can get into your message for the day.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you, Jay. Yeah. So my name is Greg Thay. I run a consultancy based in UK and Sweden called Thay Medical, and it's a company named after myself. It's very simple. I couldn't think of a better name for a company, to be honest. But yeah, we are a human factors engineering consultancy, and our role is to assist any medical device or pharmaceutical or biotech company to meet the regulatory pathway and understand intended use and unintended users. So we do combine three main elements of development into one. And that's what human factors is. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. Engineering, psychology, and clinical practice. That's what human factors is very much focused on. It's about taking technical and applying the user element to the technical. But of course, we deal with medical devices. And so we have to also understand and complement clinical practice, because at the end of the day, the indication is generally clinical. So we are mixing a sort of hybrid of industries into one in the way that, human factors encompasses everything to do with humans. And I think, to go back to the original question, a human factors test is actually a prediction of the future. So once you've gone through the regulatory pathway, your product is in the market, then it's going to be used by people. What we do is predict that use. What's it going to look like? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to meet the intended use? Is it going to meet the expectation of the people who want to use it? And of course, for many medical devices that are used for many years, this is quite important. It's for compliance is important for drugs, but for medical devices, longevity is important as well, because some can be expensive, and people do not want to replace products frequently. They want to make sure they last, and so our work dives into all areas of development. But a human factors test is like a snapshot of a clinical trial. It's take a 2-hour clinical trial, but obviously not in a clinical manner. So everything we do is simulated, and we basically try and replicate that real intended use. So the purpose of human factors testing is very much to predict the future. What's it going to look like? Did I explain it, Jay?
Oh, we've lost.
Yes, I'm back. Yes, so that does answer the question, and it is interesting to know about human factor testing. And human factor testing is going to play a vital role, and I guess even Oliver can give us some highlights maybe towards the end when I go back to him. And so yes, this is going to make a lot of sense. So and is there anything more that you want to share, Greg?
Well, I'm going to share a presentation just quickly now.
Okay.
On on the human factors, because I think one thing which I commonly get asked about is, what is human factors and what is usability? Another word that is used a lot, and people don't often know they're actually quite different. So I'm going to, if I okay with you, Jay, I'll share my screen. And I've got 4 slides to give to people to give some understanding of what human factors really is about. Okay, so I'm going to just share now. Here we go. And I'm going to make
yes, we can see your slide now.
Okay, so can you see? It's not me, by the way. It's a picture of somebody. Now, just as a foresight, I've tailored this small presentation to people who have an IQ of at least 90. So I hope all of you have got a reasonable IQ above 90. I'm sure many of you actually haven't tested yourself, but actually maybe you should. In essence, most people who work in medical devices and pharmaceuticals and biotech, we tend to have above average intelligence, which means, I've tailored this to people above an IQ of 90. That actually is human factors in a way, tailoring something to somebody or some people. So that's what human factors is very much. But let me explain it in a little bit more detail. So I've split this slide into 2 parts so you can see. Human factors is actually bigger as a subject than people think. And usability actually is just one part of it. So the regulations which we commonly have to abide by, and I'll come on to those in a few seconds, they give you actually definitions of what human factors is and what usability is. They're not the same thing. If you take away one thing, take away this. Usability is just part of human factors, because usability and usability engineering is about performance, how we as human beings perform and interact with something. So how we are interacting with Zoom right now is usability. We're using it and we're performing with it as human beings. And hopefully we're coming out to the other side with a positive user experience. Now, human factors is a lot bigger than this. And human factors actually is very much around all the things that can affect your performance. So usability is, as I say, around how you perform. Human factors are all the influences that can influence you to perform well, perform safely, or not. And so human factors engineering is very much around capability and limitations. It says in the definition. So usability is just one of the outcomes you want, ease of use. But quite clearly, being dealing with medical devices, safety is also primary. And of course, risk management, risk mitigation are big parts of human factors. But we don't focus on so much design-based or clinical-based risk mitigations, or even production-based risk mitigations. We tend to focus on user-based risk mitigations. So we look at how we can make it ideal for the human being. And so, it's everything we do is focused around all of us. And having myself being an engineer in medical device industry, it's not easy to think about humans in their entirety. It's actually quite easy to think about yourself and maybe your colleagues and your company. But actually, when you talk about populations of intended users, it becomes a little more difficult to understand people, their behaviors, their capabilities, limits, and also disabilities as well. Because in fact, by definition, unfortunately, we're all disabled in some way. So we have to make sure we understand those. So take one thing away, usability is just part of human factors, but usability is about performance. Welcome to the next slide. So when we look at a bit more detail around what human factors engineering really is, it's about 2 things really, inputs and outputs. When you look at a process, it's very much about researching first of all, and then testing. And a lot of companies think they know their intended users. They think they know their intended use very much in depth. They also think they understand how the people will use their product before they launch, and that's good. But actually, researching this in detail is always better, because again, if you're developing a product, then if you get your inputs right, as Greer mentioned, and understanding the beginning is vital to get the right output at the end. And the same from a regulatory perspective, same from clinical practice as well, of course. And so, research is vital. We get that right and we understand everything, then you'll get the right end result. And of course, testing is basically the future. It's getting a snapshot of that future with that product. The details here, we use two common phrases: formative, summative. You can look at them in terms of verification and validation if you're more American and Japanese. But in Europe here, we tend to use these phrases, which are very much around investigation, formative, and you use the word study, which by definition means to research. And then you got the words test, which means to evaluate, and summative, to sum up your human factors. So the words are very hopefully obvious, but I've put them in detail here. And a lot of it is around the process. Like on the right hand side, it's not a rocket science process. It mirrors design development, but actually you are looking at very specific things. And in fact, what we're looking at here are what we call user interfaces. So your screen right now is a user interface. You're interfacing with your screen. Your user interface is a keyboard in front of you, a speaker, a microphone. These are all things that interact with you, and therefore it's a user interface. And so we look at user interfaces of a device, and some devices will have lots and some will have very few. If I ask you to imagine a large MRI scanner, it's got multiple interfaces, whereas a syringe actually has got very few. And so understanding user interfaces is a lot of the process. But the key thing really is, there's inputs, there's process, and there's outputs, as I say. From a regulatory point of view, everything we do has to be compliant, because that makes Greer's job much more easier. It's all about making sure we're at industry level and then exceeding it as well. And so you can tell a product that's been well engineered from a human factors perspective because the manufacturer has exceeded the regulation. They've done a little bit more. They've understood their users a bit more, and they have made sure that they've focused on the user. And a good example of that is your smartphone. They are very user focused, be it Apple, be it Samsung or whoever. It's all about being focused on what is required by the regulation, and then doing a little bit more. But obviously the regulations give you a good understanding of what you need to do. And so I put in this time slot because things change a lot. And the reason for that also is partially because medical devices change a lot as well. 20 years ago, when I was designing medical devices and orthopedics, apps were non-existent. Now we use apps for every day, everything. Medical devices have changed. The regulations have to keep up with the medical devices and the technologies which we're developing so quickly. And so quite often, a lot of the regulations are revised, and different parts of the world have different expectations. So we know that the US, for example, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they lead the world on detail of human factors. They expect very human-focused products. Here in Europe, the same. And globally, there's been a lot of acceptance in the past 15 years of usability engineering and human factors, more than before that. And now we have quite strict regulations that tie into the medical device regulation, that tie into the IVDR, the in vitro directive, and many more regulations now where the human factors is just expected to be done. So the right-hand side, I always talk about the FDA waterfall method for developing a product, because actually, even though it's quite an old diagram, it still works. And you know, the user needs is what we're trying to achieve with every development. And so how we meet the user needs is down to the regulatory pathway, it's down to the competence of engineering and clinical practice. And so all we try and do is make sure we can meet user needs. Very simple. Last slide, really very much, I wanted just to let people know why human factors is important, and you know, where my team, especially myself, fit into many projects and many bits of research is around, you know, there's a device and there's a person at the end who's going to use it, and we have to make sure we understand both the intended user and the device. So a lot of human factors engineers are engineers, but we also have to have understanding of psychology and clinical practice. So we are a little bit medical, a little bit psychological, and also a bit technical as well. And that's, you know, what makes a very good human factors and usability engineer. And we have to also understand in a lot of detail the regulations as well, because otherwise we don't know how to meet them. So why is human factors engineering important? Well, the points I've got here, I think, are the last things I'm going to finish with. But the key one actually is the second one, safety. We have to make sure that what is produced is safe to use and is not going to cause harm in the future. Now, we all heard about PIP implants. There's been numerous recalls on infusion devices and very high-risk products that get into the news. That's often due to something that wasn't thought about in detail. Now, obviously, with PIP, it's about materials science and also decisions which were poorly made in management. But also often with modern devices, it's around software and user interfaces that haven't been developed either to a regulatory pathway, or they've not had enough focus on the intended user. And so a lot of this can be, you know, thought about in development. So safety really is our biggest focus. And then the last two really are also, you know, very important for us as well. There has to be a clinical benefit with the product, and we have to understand that. So obviously, you know, from a clinical point of view, making sure there's the right outcomes is vital. But also, as said earlier, you know, the human factors precedes a clinical trial quite often. So to make sure people can actually use a product in a clinical trial, you have to make sure they can use it, and therefore you have to apply human factors before that. And you know, the key thing also is we have to have a positive user experience, and that's something that's really come about in the past 25 years, really. We don't want, you know, if we want to use a product, whatever it is, we have to want to use it, not be forced to use it. And this is where the psychology of use comes in, and it comes from consumer products, it comes from all industries. If we are tied into a product, we'll use it, and we'll use it safely. If we don't want to use it, we'll take shortcuts, we'll not use it safely, or we'll not use it correctly, and we'll have negative user experiences, and no one wants that. So we want to have positive user experiences. That aids compliance, that aids the selling process. I mean, how many people take an iPhone and then they want the next version? Because actually the current one gives them a positive user experience. It promotes sales. And that's the psychology. So that's human factors. It's, yeah, prediction of the future, and it has benefits.
That's quite interesting to understand, and I'm sure our audience have quite understood really well about human factor testing. And thanks for covering them in a very short manner, Greg. And I'm sure these slides are very helpful to everyone to understand and visualize what you are talking about. And yes, now, okay, thanks for stopping the screen share. And now I would just like to take it on and go in a very quick format to Brenda, who would be talking to us about market access, because as we mentioned, young and new medical device manufacturers they have the certifications, they have everything in process, but they don't know about the market access. So Brenda, can you please throw some light on market access?
Sure, thanks very much, Jay. And I'm I suppose, a reimbursement specialist. I founded Access Consulting nearly 10 years ago. So we support pharmaceutical companies, biotechs and medtech companies across Ireland and indeed the UK, quite specifically, I suppose, devolved nations, Scotland and Wales. So just very briefly, and I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure there's a couple of minutes left at the end for questions. So I'm just going to cut this down a little bit in terms of what I want to cover. But I thought it's probably important, first of all, to have a standard view as to what market access is and what that term means, because it's used quite a bit and it means different things to different people. From my point of view, I suppose, and how I define market access is that it's a science in its own right. And it's really the science which underpins any manufacturer's ability to be able to make that technology that they've developed available to the patients who can derive the most benefit, but also ensuring that the technology is funded. So in the main, when I say funded, I clearly mean reimbursed by payers in a given jurisdiction. And really, it doesn't matter what jurisdiction. It can be the States, it can be Ireland, UK, it doesn't matter. It's the same principles applying. So in my view, with a lot of time spent, miles on the clock in market access, really and truly, it has to follow a very clear and very purposeful strategic course. And that course has to be steered and set from the very outset. And unfortunately, a lot of the times it's left to the last piece, which is too late. It's too late to be developing a market access strategy for reimbursement at the end of the process. It has to go back to the beginning. And like Greer has said earlier, and indeed Liz, it's a twin track approach. This is all things have to come together here. So it does require that bit of thinking. And it should start very early on in the product life cycle. So I suppose if we think about the average time it takes for a new medical technology to come through the process, about 4.5 years between your R&D and your regulatory strategy and compliance and manufacturing and clinical trials, all of that piece of work should also be supported by a very clear pathway to market access. So we know that all health economies, regardless of jurisdiction, face funding challenges. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And we've certainly seen in the last number of years, there's quite a shift towards value assessment. Value is the king word now, and it needs to be thought about for every entrepreneur that's trying to bring through a technology. And I suppose we need to think then about, well, what are the payers looking for? So if I was to use, I suppose, just a simple analogy, and it was really prompted by Greer's very clever title for today in terms of, that we all must have the t-shirts, and I really liked it. So I'd like you just to think about a t-shirt, and a t-shirt being the analogy or the metaphor for your medical technology. And if I could, I would want you to emblazon on that t-shirt 3 P's, and all of them pointing to a very big E in the center. And just let me explain what that is. So your 3 P's are, first of all, patients, providers, and payers. And what we'd be wanting to do with each of those is look for where is value demonstrated. So if I take patients first of all, and again, that has just been spoken about so interestingly, and I had not heard about human factor work before, but it's quite interesting. But looking at the patients, where's the value? And in terms of to them, what are the patient reported outcome measures that matter? And how has that been correctly expressed so that value is meaningful and it's not just a principle. The next P is clearly for providers, so the healthcare providers, those that are clearly running the services for us. Where's the value to them? Can you show that? Can you demonstrate that in terms of reduction in hospital stays? Can you show efficiencies in service provisions? Can you reduce the amount of times or frequency you have to replace particular joints in an ankle or a knee or whatever? So you're really trying to think about value from that perspective. And then, of course, not surprisingly, P for the payer. So how are you going to demonstrate to the payer that you are bringing value in terms of your new technology? And that is really the critical one, because it has to be in their language. And payers look for data in a particular way, and it might not be in the same way that the regulatory authority wanted to see the data presented. In fact, it's often, it's complementary, but it can be quite different. So back to my center point, what's that big E? And in case you haven't guessed it, it is, of course, evidence. Evidence, evidence, evidence. So Liz has spoken and indeed Greer with regards to the clinical efficacy and the effectiveness, and that's core for payers as well. But the other piece of the evidence chain that they need to see is your cost effectiveness. So how can you demonstrate that, and how can you really inform the system that what you're bringing is actually truly of value? So that will sometimes involve a thing called health technology assessment. It's an economic evaluation, but that does help to demonstrate value. It also includes budget impact assessment. So what's the financial repercussions? And in particular, what are the cost offsets? So if you're bringing something to a system, fine, you can model out what it's going to cost, but what are the cost offsets? So therefore, where's the value implicit? So I think for me, it's about encouraging all clients that we work with, all new entrepreneurs coming through, is to really think about that big E, because that's the central point. What's your evidence like? And can you make that evidence really start to develop from an early stage? And I think about the work that Liz does in terms of, you know, clinical trials, it's not too difficult to start thinking about how can I piggyback on work that's going to be done in a clinical trial setting to show, for example, improvements in quality of life for patients. How can I add in something like an EQ5D study on top of what I'm already paying for to get data that is meaningful to the payers? Mightn't mean an awful lot from a regulatory standpoint, but it means an awful lot to the payers. So time I know has run out a little bit. I had some case studies I was going to speak to, but really I hope that that has just been helpful to sort of cut to what I think is the heart and the essence of market access. Thanks, Jay.
Yes, thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing your inputs. And yes, I'm sure that the attendees would have loved to hear the case studies, but again, the time has been passed out. And I had a question from one of the audience who has asked how many patients we should get involved to have a proper clinical trial for new medical devices. So anyone from the panel who would like to take on this question?
I can take that one.
Oh, yes.
That depends entirely on the question that you want to answer. So, you know, clinically, what are you going to be looking at in your trial? Are you going to be looking at a particular percentage improvement in a EQ5D quality of life score, for example? And if so, then, you know, it's a significant piece of work to look at the mathematics behind that. And, you know, sample size calculations take an awful lot of time and are very involved. They're very important and they're pivotal to your trial. So, you know, the very first thing that you want to start out to do is say, what is it that I want to say about my product? What claims do I want to make? And that tracks back to the conversations that you will have had with your regulatory support. And you know, to Brenda's point, the trial that you design can bring in a lot of things that are important and can kill as many birds with one stone as possible. You know, we can validate some of that human factors information and make sure that when you reach out to a slightly different or wider audience, you know, people are reinforcing what you think about your product and saying, yes, we agree, it's great. We really like the green on button and the red off button and, you know, all the kind of things that make it simple to use. And, you know, particularly when you're looking at technology that's going to be used in groups of people that perhaps aren't very technologically minded anyway, you know, older people and people that don't use this kind of thing in their daily life. And you know, to Brenda's point about having that extra little bit of data, it's one field in a database and one question, and it's not going to significantly impact the cost of your study. Most of the money in setting up your trial is spent on applications and document creation and project management and, you know, all of the above, and site costs. So it's really important to think holistically about what you can do with your trial and what you can bring in to satisfy all of these things, and for it not to be a sequential process.
Okay, yeah, that's really great, and thanks for answering. And before I just wind up this, I would just like to speak to Oliver. And Oliver, as a medical device manufacturer, what are your key takeaways that you have taken from each panel member present here, and what is it that you are going to now implement for your medical technology?
I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from everything that everyone's spoken about is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. and that actually you need to be thinking really fundamentally about what your device is doing, what you're trying to achieve with that, and making sure that you're putting in the foundations to be able to scale and to actually have the impact that you want to achieve with that. And yeah, it can be frustrating at times when you you want a nice, quick, simple, easy answer, like sort of how many people should I be recruiting for a study? But yeah, fundamentally, it isn't as simple as that. And actually, you do need to be thinking about exactly what you're trying to achieve at every step. So making sure that you have the fundamental foundations in place early, such that you can build on them, you can expand, you can grow, you can be sustainable, and then ultimately having that clinical impact and that sort of societal impact that you're trying to achieve.
Okay, yes, that's very interesting. And yes, thank you, Oliver, for answering that. And I'm sure we all get the medical device technologies back and get all the consultants if required. And yes, before I wind up, I would like to thank each and every presenter to support Medidia in this entire presentation. I'm sure the medical device manufacturers can now get the t-shirt. And yes, over to Alicia. I guess you can start with your On Helix presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Jay, and to the whole panel. For me, that was like the 101 of medtech. It was just everything you needed to know. So we had product development, we had engineering, regulatory, clinical, market access. So really, really interesting, very thorough. So thank you very much for all of your contributions. And I do hope that attendees on the line have found it helpful as well, as I'm sure you have done. So with that, I did put a message in the chat. I did put my email address in there. Very happy to connect anyone interested with Jay, who can then do facilitation at his end. Alternatively, I know Greer is on the conference app, so you can use the conference app to make connections that way as well. And a recording will be available as part of the on-demand content too. So with that, I'm going to close the session, and I just have to highlight that we are back tomorrow with further innovation workshops. We kick off at 10 a.m. with a session on data protection in clinical trials. And then there's a few more throughout the day as well. So please do check those out and join us for those. So with that, I'm going to wish everyone a good rest of the day, and thank you very much. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.